Welcome everyone. Thanks for turning up to the webinar. There are lots of people today from across the world that are registered to participate. That might suggest there's quite a lot of uncertainty in the world at the moment. So, quick introductions. My name is Nikki. I'll be the moderator today in the webinar. And with me is Dr. Ilevbare, which is a product manager for the Innovation Technology Management Services at the Institute, and Dr. Rob Phaal, which is a Principal Research Associate at the Center for Technology Management. So the format today will be a short introduction to the Institute for Manufacturing, and that will be followed by about 30-minute overview of the strategic road mapping. And then we'll have at the end about 15 minutes questions and answers. So we're expecting a lot of participants today. So we'll want to encourage participation and a lot of discussion. And hence this session is moderated. You are welcome to put any questions you have and any comments in the box. And then we'll answer all of them or most of them at the end. And I pass now to Dr. Phaal.
Thanks, Nikki. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'll start off the presentation and hand over to Imoh partway through. So just a few words of introduction in terms of who we are and what we do. You can see on the bottom right of this slide the Institute for Manufacturing, or IFM, and that's basically another name for one division of engineering department here at Cambridge, which is an integrated department. On the left of this slide, you can see our main areas of activity. Not surprisingly, perhaps, we have a lot of educational programs and research, but what's a little bit unusual is the degree of practice that we participate in, and that is working with collaborating partners in industry, government, and university to apply and develop practical methods. And so that sort of interaction between the outside world, primarily industry, but also government and universities, working on research, education, and practice together distinguishes what we do. So we want to make sure that in our research programs and our education, we have a very clear voice of practice to integrate those three areas. Now, focusing a little bit more on the area of research we're talking about today, technology and innovation management. This has been an ongoing stream of activity for quite some time, since 1993 or so. And I've just highlighted four areas of ongoing interest here. We've always been interested in the processes and systems which can support the management of technology and innovation in companies and nations too. And a very applied aspect of this is practical management tools and toolkits. So every tool has strengths and weaknesses, and you can combine them together to address practical challenges. So we've been developing tools for many years, but also we have an interest in the nature of management tools themselves. The third bullet point there is really an approach to problem solving where we call this fast start method. We tend to focus on the human side of things, bringing together the different stakeholders that need to align their thinking, and we tend to iterate fast. So this fast start concept was really based on the concept of rapid prototyping solutions. More recently, as we'll come to later, you might find this sort of philosophy linked to lean and agile traditions. And finally, another ongoing strand is that many of these methods have a strong visual component. And that's very helpful in bringing people together, but also communicating more widely. So on to the topic of today. We're talking about strategy in times of uncertainty. And strategy is not surprisingly challenging. And I just highlighted three issues here that cause difficulty when undertaking strategic discussions and developing strategy. Firstly, the systems we're talking about here, the industrial systems, the technologies, and so forth, are very complex. There are many pieces to the jigsaw puzzle, and that complexity is a major headache to deal with. On top of that, and linked to the complexity, is that you need many different views involved to develop a coherent strategy. different stakeholders, different functions, different organizations potentially, and they may think in different ways and use different language. So there's lots of ambiguity in the discussions. And finally, uncertainty is a major headache to deal with, and we can't avoid it. And I'm just highlighting two sources of uncertainty. The top one there is concerned with the future, because strategy is always time dependent. We're trying to make decisions today that have longer term implications, and predictions are hard, especially about the future. That quote is often attributed to Niels Bohr, although that's uncertain itself. And so we'll come back to that in particular and talk about one method that you can combine with road mapping, scenario planning. Imoh will cover that shortly. But we want to also highlight another source of uncertainty, and that is the quality of the information and knowledge on which you base your strategy. Clearly, a high-quality strategy will demand high-quality information and knowledge. And so a lot of the uncertainty that you're dealing with is because we have imperfect knowledge or poor quality information, and then clearly the decisions we make will also be a lack of confidence in those. So I'm going to talk about the second one first and how road mapping can help with that. So this framework is kind of the sort of master diagram in a way to emphasize some key features that sit behind road mapping as a technique. And firstly, on the left-hand side there, you can see a whole lot of perspectives. This is a sort of a maybe typical perspectives that you might see in an industrial application. And for a successful strategy, we somehow have to integrate all of these perspectives together. And those perspectives often relate to different stakeholder views, which you can see on the left. And so we have to somehow bring all of those views together to develop this integrated view, content on this structure. So on the left-hand side, we really have a systems-based view set against time, the horizontal axis. So what's sitting behind road mapping is a dynamic systems framework that allows any system to be examined in terms of how it changes, how it evolves, how it develops. And it's a very flexible tool, as you can see from this, because you can design the structure of the roadmap to specifically fit the nature of the problem and the context in terms of the focal issues of concern, but also the scope of factors that you have to consider. Now, having an information architecture like this is very helpful for clarifying what you know, what you need to know, and to frame the problem correctly. If you don't have a common structure like this, it's very hard to have coherent strategic dialogue. And so what road mapping brings is not a very analytical tool. It really brings structure in a very holistic way that allows all of the pieces of the jigsaw to be fitted together. So a roadmap really you can think of it as being like the picture on the front of the jigsaw puzzle box. Everyone has pieces of the jigsaw, but we somehow have to see the overall picture. And so we have to bring in information which we might gather from all sorts of different sources, but also knowledge, and that usually comes with people. So you can blend both digital technologies, software and so on, but very importantly, don't forget the human interaction involved with developing roadmaps and deploying strategy. Now, sitting behind the structure, highlighted in red there, are 6 fundamental questions. And so road mapping at its heart is really simple. It's bringing structure to bear on issues that are complex, ambiguous, and uncertain. And that's where the challenge lies. We don't want to bring a complicated tool to address complicated problems. So if I'm going to be confronted with a novel application, I would revert to this very generic framework, which suggests that all roadmaps and therefore all strategy can be separated into a 3x3 grid. On the timeline, we need to have a sense of direction. Where do we want to go? Without a sense of direction, it's pretty difficult to know whether today's situation is acceptable or not. Where are we now with respect to that future state, and how can we bridge the gap? The contention on the vertical axis is that for roadmaps to be complete, and therefore for complete strategy, you need 3 orthogonal perspectives to be represented. By tradition, the top of the roadmap is concerned with why do we need to act, what's motivating us. The middle is the very tangible, what should we do? What kind of products, applications, services would help to address those issues? And the lower part of the roadmap is, how can we make that happen? Now, the roadmap doesn't really give you any answers. What it does is impose some structure and logic, and then you need to bring to bear all of the other know-how you have and tools and techniques to help address and answer these questions. Now, it's often said that the process of road mapping is more important than the roadmap itself. It's very easy to fixate on the artifact that's produced as a product of road mapping, but the process itself, a lot of the value lies in that, and in particular in the way that you bring people together to have strategic discussions, which may then be captured in a roadmap for wider communication. So it's very difficult to tell from published roadmaps or complete roadmaps what happened at earlier stages. And you can use the road mapping framework throughout that process. At the early stages, there'll be a lot of uncertainty, there'll be lots of knowledge gaps, and the output of every step then is actions to move forward, typically to reduce the unknown knowledge, to reduce uncertainty and build confidence. And we would always advocate a fast start approach to this, really, where you iterate fast at the beginning as a learning process. That helps you clarify exactly what the assumptions are, what the exam question is, and clarify what kind of information knowledge you need, to what level of quality to support the decisions you need to make. When I say agile and lean, I'll just highlight really the key points from each of those different domains. In terms of agile, which is very popular in software development, the key point here, I think, is the rapid iteration. If you build that into your strategy and innovation process, then you'll help to remove a lot of uncertainty at early stages. You don't overcommit and then find that you've asked the wrong question much later on. A lean tradition has its roots in quality and production, and there's a very strong tradition in visual methods. If you can't see it, you can't manage it. So you find visual management systems deployed in companies from both the lean and agile traditions. And in the end, I think they look rather similar in the sense that you have a visual system and you have people engaged with those visual objects, potentially supported by software, of course, as well. Just one small example of a roadmap. This is extracted one of many roadmaps in this document, the little picture on the left, from some of the work we did in collaboration with Shell in Kazakhstan, looking to how they can leverage investments in oil and gas technologies into other areas of their economy. This is a sub-roadmap, one particular topic on a page relating to seismic data acquisition. Now, this is the only example I'm going to really show. There's many examples available on the internet. By examining this roadmap, it's quite hard to know exactly what process went on to create it, and it wouldn't be clear that the initial discussions were had in a workshop format with a group of key stakeholders, creating the first version of this, which was then supplemented by a lot of other available information in the project. So just to really emphasize, the quality of strategy depends critically on the quality of the information and knowledge that's incorporated into it. But the amount of information and which knowledge is relevant isn't always that clear to start with. So that's why we advocate this iterative approach, where at the end of a day or two, you can hope to have some immediate benefits, perhaps resolving some current dilemmas, but which will get you on a path towards a coherent strategy in the medium term. But it's important to get some value from that first iteration. So we often focus in a sort of diagnostic mode or problem-solving mode. These photographs were from a one-day workshop, an innovation strategy workshop. We're covering the whole scope of the company. We had about 25 people in that room covering various functions, commercial and technical. And the big chart on the wall is what we call the landscape, where we've structured that specifically for the company and the problems that they were facing. And we're making sure we have all of the perspectives visible so that we can use that as a resource to drill down into areas that require more attention. So we're selectively drilling down based on the knowledge we gain at that higher level. Now, at the end of that workshop, one of the key outputs would be to identify the key knowledge gaps or information gaps that we would need to improve on to build confidence moving forward. And so there's a very intimate relationship between the intelligence function of gathering information and the strategy process, which is a consumer of that information, and it produces information needs. So quite typically a company would go into some sort of intelligence process there. Bigger companies may have a formal system, smaller companies would do it more informally. But that little model there, if anyone's interested, we can provide the paper. It defines 4 different types of searching. 2 internally, where you mine data that you know you have, or trawl through the organization for information you're not sure you have. And external modes, where you target specific gaps identified in your strategy process, and a more open-ended scanning process. So you'll find, I think, always you'd be iterating between steps in your strategy process and information and knowledge generation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, all tools have strengths and weaknesses, and you really need a toolkit to address most problems, where the strength of one tool will counter the weaknesses of another. Road mapping has a particular role to play in toolkits because its prime function really is integration of strategy, process, but also tools. So I've always been able to relate any tool or management tool I've seen to the structure of a roadmap. And this schematic here is just meant to highlight that. So for example, you might have a competitive layer in the top part of the roadmap. And if you have a question mark there, Michael Porter's well-known 5 forces model could be used to shine a light on that so that you can come back and remove that question mark. There are 2 tools highlighted here in blue, and we'll be focusing on those a bit more in the context of uncertainty. I'll just touch on portfolios, and then Imoh will cover scenario planning in more depth. In terms of portfolio diagrams, the generic form we tend to use for prioritizing which options are most attractive is shown here, where we're looking at the scale of the opportunity and the feasibility of attaining that. And each of these might have a number of factors sitting underneath. And what we do for uncertainty is we recognize that uncertainty exists and we should embrace it. So for every single factor, we accept a range of values, a plausible higher upper bound and a plausible lower bound. And that all gets rolled onto this diagram, where each of these would effectively be a rectangle, but we're just pinning it to the top right and bottom left, otherwise to simplify the graphic. And so instead of generating false conflict in the workshop to come up with a spurious average, we accept the uncertainty, and then we can have an interesting conversation as to how do we maximize the upside and manage the downside. In this little schematic, for example, there would be 3 projects there which are definitely good. The upside and downside are all positive, the green ones. The red ones, the upside and downside aren't so great, but the yellow ones are interesting because the upside is attractive, but the downside is not so good. So one can sort of plan for those options in a more sophisticated way to account for the upside and downside perspective. That's where things like options thinking, which we'll come on to in a minute, are very helpful. So dealing with uncertainty, we've always found this simple model from Courtney and colleagues, published in the Harvard Business Review, to be very useful, which identifies just 4 levels of uncertainty. So moving from the bottom up on the left, we have situation level 1, where basically you're confident that your forecasts are reasonably accurate. Level 2 means that the forecasts start to break down and you have to start to think of alternative routes to the future. Level 3 even is more uncertainty, where there's a range of possible futures. We may or may not be able to really identify the path there. And level 4 is where it's true ambiguity, really difficult to make any sense of the world. Now, just one current example in the UK of this is shown on the right, where in June last year, there was a referendum on whether the UK should remain a member of the EU or leave. And the referendum, as most people know, came out to leave. And so Brexit was defined as meaning Brexit initially. And that was all we were told. And that, if you define a term by itself, it's probably an indication that there's lots of ambiguity. Moving forward now to today, the last few days actually, with Article 50 being triggered, and now that we find there's an election in the way, I would say we're maybe at level 3, when we can imagine a range of possible futures. Hopefully, moving forward over the next couple of years, we'll ratchet down the uncertainty to level 2 and 1, where people can start to make plans and bets with more confidence. Now, the kind of tools you use need to fit the context. And so there are different kinds of tools that can be used at these different levels. I've just highlighted a couple in each. For example, system dynamics can help understand the nature of the system and could perhaps help if you're in a situation where you really don't know what's going on. Scenarios, which Imoh will talk about in a few minutes, is a really useful tool for level 3. And options analysis is a very logical tool for level 2 and forecasting for level 1. And I've cheekily put road mapping in every level because we know that it can be used for all levels, although you'll use it in a very different way. So in level 1, roadmaps would have a lot of views of the future with forecasts to back them up, and probably share quite a lot of characteristics with project planning. While at level 4, you'll use road mapping in a very exploratory manner. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Imoh to talk a little bit about scenario planning.
Thanks, Rob. As Rob said, in road mapping and in most of other planning, when you're looking to create a roadmap, you're looking to where you are now. You're looking at where you want to be, and then how you get there from where you are now to where you want to be. But the question is, when the future is uncertain and you really cannot picture where you want to be because the prevailing circumstances are such that there's so much complexity that any view you try to take, you're left a bit confused. What do? Now, if you recall the previous slide, and imagining that we really are at level 3 uncertainty at the moment, and scenarios could be a very useful thing to use. Now, what are scenarios? Scenarios they provide a set of plausible futures or alternative future situations, and they are very useful when you need clarity on where you want to be. And they do this really based on projections of present trends and drivers, and these drivers could be socioeconomic, they could be political, and then an exploration and combination of these. It's by that we deduce the scenarios, and these scenarios sometimes come in 4s. It's typical for them to come in 4s, like you can see on the right-hand side of the present slide. But each scenario is meant to be plausible and internally consistent, meaning that it can happen and it is realistic. So there's no point in creating scenarios that cannot actually happen. But what this will do really here is that it gives you an idea of what the future might look like. So where you're faced with a range of possibilities, breaking it down into a number, say 4, gives you a better footing to make plans going forward. Now, what scenarios are not? Scenarios are not predictions, and no scenario would accurately predict the future, and I just want to highlight that. Now, what is the advantage of doing this? If you are able to view the future, say, in 4 possibilities, you can more easily identify the risks and the opportunities associated with each one, and then you can, say, start making appropriate plans or taking appropriate steps to take hold of those opportunities if they were to emerge, and also to address the threats if they were to emerge. As such, as an organization or as a company, you're already at a more forward footing, you're more advantaged when you need to respond to the scenarios when they eventually emerge. Now, if you look at the current manufacturing landscape, what I've put on the left-hand side of this slide is just a few examples of the global trends in manufacturing that we are facing, and this has been drawn from a report that was recently presented at United Nations in the past month by one of our colleagues. But some of these things might apply to you as an organization, and things like automation, reshoring, especially with all the political talk going on around, new technologies, for example. And what we can do is sort of bring a way of the combination of these trends and drivers, make sense of them, and translate them into a more structured view of the future in terms of scenarios. How do we use scenarios with road mapping? We're talking really about road mapping here, but when we're facing uncertainty, how can we combine road mapping and scenarios? Now, there are two configurations that we have used. The first one is scenario-led road mapping. I'll explain that in a minute. And the second one is road mapping-led scenarios. Now, in scenario-led road mapping, if, say, we had 4 scenarios that we are looking at as possibilities of the future, we will then, based on these 4 scenarios, create 4 roadmaps, a roadmap for each scenario. And then what we do is find a way of combining these 4 roadmaps into a synthesized central roadmap, so that you can stop focusing on the 4 pictures of the future in form of the 4 scenarios, and then look solely at that one roadmap. But what that one roadmap will do will be a combination of the 4 possibilities, and helps you to actually look at the different pathways, the different options as to what might happen and how you might react to it. So that is one configuration of how you might use road mapping and scenarios together. Now, the second one, which we call road mapping led scenario, is that you actually start with a roadmap, and that's why we call it road mapping led. But in this case, you use the scenarios you have to test how well the roadmap behaves or will behave under each scenario. So, for example, take scenario A and scenario C, and you look at, if it were to happen that, for example, Brexit goes in a certain way, what are the plans or the roadmap we already have drawn? How would it react? And if it were to go another way, that's Brexit, how then would the roadmap react? Basically, what we are doing here is to stress test the roadmap against possible future states or future conditions. And what we then get is a modified but more robust, more flexible, more dynamic roadmap afterwards. Now, there are a few key things to note in using scenarios and road mapping, and these things are important. Number one, if you were to create roadmaps from a number of scenarios, it's very important that you identify the commonalities across those roadmaps. And basically, if there are things that are emerging in each scenario or each scenario roadmap, then obviously those are things that you should do. Now, it's obvious that there are things that will be different across the roadmaps. And in this case, this is where you need to start thinking about strategic options and how you would perhaps make decisions under certain conditions and so on. Now, how would you know if a scenario were to start to play out or to emerge? Say, of the 4 scenarios you have identified, how would you know that one is playing out? That is where you need to identify signals or triggers. And these are things that will give you an indication that the scenario is playing out. And we will usually do this in workshops by asking people and experts to contribute in certain ways to identify what the signals and triggers are. Now, moving slightly away from scenarios and looking more widely at risk management and how you might address uncertainty and risk in road mapping, there is something we call risk-aware road mapping, which basically is road mapping, because roadmaps help you to address uncertainties and risks. But there is a little bit of that we also put into consideration when we carry out our workshop and work with companies. and that is the subjectivity issue. People would come to these roadmaps and would address these situations or try to understand them in different ways, based on their perceptions, based on their biases, and also based on how the group works together. So if you have a generally risk-averse group, how will they address uncertainty? How will they react to it? How will they deal with it? And we have ways in which we take note of these things and also try to minimize them where they have a negative effect. So it's something to keep in mind and to understand how to deal with when you're doing road mapping. Just coming to the end, I wanted to pass across a few key principles as to how we do road mapping and how we use it to deal with uncertain and complex situations. Rob talked about the agile lean approach, and our toolkits really are that. But there are a few other key principles. Number one, it's very human-centric. We work with people right from the beginning of the problem to the very end, and we rely on the involvement of members of the organization to work things out. So working with you, working things out with you right through the journey of developing a roadmap. Our roadmap, so our processes are very workshop-based, and that's quite important if you're going to involve a range of people, and we look for a range. Also neutrally facilitated. We facilitate but from a distance, but importantly, what that does is that you own the process, the company owns the process, the organization owns the process, but also it's very lightly processed, scalable, and visual. Now coming to the last point, visual, right on top of the slide, at the top of the slide there, you'd see a template. It's one of the workshop templates we use. And in this case, this template incorporates road mapping and scenarios and the demonstration of options thinking. We haven't talked very much about options thinking, but I think given that we've run out of time, it's something that we can discuss with you, perhaps individually if you'd like to pick that up. But basically, it's a way of responding to scenarios and scenario roadmaps and generating a range of ways in which you can make your plans and structure your decisions for the future. So that brings us to the end of the webinar, as it were. But of course, we need to take your questions and try to answer them as well as we can. We'll do this for about 15 minutes, and Nikki will be moderating for us.
Okay, please feel free if you have any questions for Rob and Imoh to add them now to the box on the bottom of your webinar. One question has already arrived, which is how much external knowledge do you need to complete scenarios, and how much can be informed by the organization's employees?
All right, I'll take that. In terms of the amount of external knowledge you have, I think the important thing is to actually identify how much internal knowledge you can bring to bear, first of all, and identify the gaps in that internal knowledge. So you might remember the slide that Rob shared on the technology intelligence aspect. There are things that you already know within your organization. So a part of the process, road mapping or scenarios, is identifying how much knowledge we actually can bring to bear from within your organization. We identify the gaps, and then that will give us an indication of how much we need to do in terms of bringing people in from outside. What this relies on really is that fast iteration, making sure that we go through the process quickly in terms of identifying what we need to know, and then looking for the sources of information from outside. So it will vary from situation to situation, from context to other context, and from organization to organization. There's no standard answer to how much external knowledge we really would need. I don't know if Rob has anything to add to that, but really that's the way we would address this. So there's no standard answer, but it's something that we can find out very quickly once we get into the process.
Okay, another question is how long does the process tend to take?
It relates to Imoh's answer, I think, that if you start quick and iterate fast, then you should expect some early benefits, and focusing on some problems of current strategic challenge, or using these techniques in diagnostic mode can ensure that you get a quick win, and then that sets you on a journey. So a contact I had in Philips used to always say, think big but act small, and take some small steps in the direction towards when you want to go. And then as you learn about the tool and as you adapt it for your particular context, you can strengthen it as required. But you can always make it bigger, but starting small, just squeezing it down to a day or two is the challenge.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Another question is, how often should we review or revisit an existing roadmap?
I think there's a number of answers to that. Companies will very typically align their road mapping process with other business processes, such as strategy, which might have an annual cycle linked to budget allocation, or review points in development stage gate processes would be a natural place to update your roadmap, or when things change. So if you've got a roadmap and an event happens, it would be a logical thing to immediately go back to the roadmap and say what has changed. There is another answer to this, and that's if you use a visual management system, an agile approach, or a lean innovation system, which is rather similar, you'll find that you'll have a much more frequent update process. So typically in lean innovation systems, people might have a weekly cycle where they just review things, make sure things are going forward okay, with maybe periodic larger reviews.
Okay, a few more questions. One is, can you give some hints on how to most effectively proceed with implementation of the roadmap?
So this is implementation of the strategy, or the content of on the roadmap. I think that if that's what's meant, then it's basically a change management challenge, and good management principles should be brought to bear. I think the roadmap has a key role in supporting the integration and alignment of the various projects that would be necessary to move forward with the roadmap. So once you get a roadmap to that point, it becomes relatively stable, and it supports your program management. At earlier stages, when you're creating a strategy, you're using the method in a slightly different way.
Okay, another question is, does the IFM do applied research in system dynamics in the context of road mapping?
We haven't. That's a very good question, because it's been an obvious thing in my mind for many years that the system dynamics models, road mapping is a dynamic systems framework, and system dynamics, where you look at the sort of cause and effect in systems, is clearly a related technique. I don't think anyone's actually formally linked those methods, although it seems pretty clear to me that if you look at the time cycles in system dynamic models, you would basically sort of spread that system out over the time dimension of a roadmap. So you could see the long loops and the short loops much more clearly. And I think it's a very sensible thing to do. And if you wanted to really do the sort of modeling that system dynamics enables you to do, overlaid on a road mapping canvas, you could do a better job. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for if somebody's got expertise in system dynamics to combine it with road mapping.
Okay, another question is, how do you justify doing road mapping in times when traditional planning might seem like a too slow process, and when you need to adapt to an environment that it changes fast?
Well, the way we do road mapping here typically is to take a very fast start approach. And what I mean by fast start is that we try to cut out all the, if you like, the administrative bureaucracy that might come with a typical, say, annual planning exercise, and just get people together in the same room and get them to work on creating a roadmap. So really, it's about this fast start approach and making sure that it works. The thing about this is that it by bringing people together into one room and helping them to create a roadmap, there's also the communication that goes that goes with it, and people are able to discuss. And actually, there's a bit of learning that comes out of it as well. By sharing opinions and discussing, there's the ability to create new learning and ways that you probably were not thinking previously before. And this quite dovetails nicely into how you deal with uncertainty. I'm not sure if I got all of the question. What else? Question? I think there are two parts to the question.
It is when the environment seems to be changing very
fast. Yes, and yes, of course. When the environment is changing really fast, I think, again, this aligns quite well with the fast start approach we use, because then you don't want to get into the rigor of a traditional planning process. You want something that you can use that's agile and quite lean in terms also of resources that you bring to bear. The resource, the time, it's all minimized in the approach we take. And that's really one that we have found to work with very many organizations and organizations of all types and sizes. So really you can bring it to work. We've worked with, and we've seen organizations that have these things called pulse rooms, where they go into the room, have a meeting for maybe half a day, and out comes something in the form of maybe a roadmap or maybe something slightly different, if not doing exactly road mapping. But that really is, I think, an approach to go for if you are worried about the planning cycles and so on.
Okay, one more question. Do we have specific tools or methodologies to assess risks and opportunities?
Yes, of course we do. Many of them are not dissimilar from the typical methodologies you would use in risk management. But I think the trick here is how you would integrate them with road mapping and knowing which one to apply at what point in the roadmap. So there are typical things that you could do regarding how to identify, assess, and treat risks. There are issues that you could also look at when it goes beyond what traditionally you call the risk, and maybe when it gets into things like uncertainty and ambiguity, and looking at what specific tools you can use. Now, if you recall one of the slides that we presented previously, I'll just scuttle back towards that slide. That one, Rob presented this slide, and if you look at level 2 and level 3 uncertainty, there's real options, which is something that we have used in the form of options thinking, and also scenarios. Now, beyond this, there are other tools. There are some risk maturity tools that you can use to assess how well your organization can address risks in certain in certain issues, and so on and so forth. So it really is understanding what the problem, especially when we work with organizations, what the risk problem is and how best to deal with that risk issue using the appropriate tools and techniques. So there are specific ones, and if you want a more detailed sort of feedback or outline of tools, then we can take it offline and get in touch with you as well.
Okay, there are 3 more questions. One is, can we provide an example of a synthesized central roadmap in scenario-led roadmap?
I'm not sure if I'd have to go back and check exactly what the output was, but we did quite a lot of work with the railway industry a few years ago, where we brought scenario planning in as a road mapping led approach. So we used it as a sensitivity analysis. And then I think we did integrate one roadmap out of that in the way that Imoh described. Another notable feature of that project was we used some options thinking to deal with the asynchronous nature of infrastructure and political cycles. So the railways take a long time to build, much longer horizon than the political cycle. So how do you plan for railways when policy may shift? So what they did was they prepared 50 options up front, and they understood each option and how it would contribute to the policy goals, so that if they had a shift in policy, they could adapt the plan rapidly. So I think that example is public domain. It's on our website.
Yeah, there are other examples as well that are more private, which unfortunately we cannot share. But recently we did a piece of work with a company, a multinational, that involved looking at scenarios and coming to a common plan based on those scenarios. And the way we did it was, basically looking at those commonalities and the significant differences. Unfortunately, we cannot share this, but the one Rob mentioned, I think it's on the internet, the RSSB one.
That's right.
Yes, so that's that we can, perhaps you can look for it yourselves, but maybe if you can get in touch with us, we'll be able to send you a copy of that report.
So 30-year technology strategy for the UK rail industry.
Okay. Two more questions. One is, ownership seems to be key in realizing the roadmap. Are there any other usual blockers to overcome realization?
Well, I'll just re-emphasize that point. I think Imoh may have some wider points, but ownership is very fundamental and often a real challenge. So if you think of the integrated roadmap, for example, a technology layer may be owned by a technology director, the product layer may be owned by a product manager or marketing group, but who owns the overall roadmap? The finger points very firmly upwards to the most senior managers. So if you don't get the support of the chief executive, really, or the general manager, the integrated roadmap's not going to really serve its purpose. So I think the ownership is probably top, apart from being clear about the needs and so on, is probably the key enabler.
Okay, and the final question, there are a few more that we reply individually because we ran out of time, but the final for today is, as it says, how you can get the participants to think of future challenges or issues, because the experience shows that people don't like to think in mid-term or long-term.
Well, I think one thing that's important is getting the mindset of the participants in the right place. And what I mean by the right place is making them understand how quickly things can change. I've been in some of Rob's presentations and work with companies where simply demonstrating how, if you like, infallible our predictions are. Say, for example, what was thought of in terms of how space travel will work in the future, or how things will turn out technologically in the past, say, 20, 30 years. How people thought of 2017 was very different. And it's important to think about, get them to know that it's important to think about how the future might change. It's really about getting them to change their mindset, to think about the future. Also, simple things like simply getting them out of the organization setting and into a neutral situation and position might also help. So it's at least a combination of those two things, in my opinion, and experience that might work to get companies to think more about the future. Sometimes certain techniques might help and might work, and that's where maybe scenarios might come in, and a few other things as well to help them think, basically shift their mindset away from how they have thought traditionally, if you like.
Okay, thanks everyone. This is the end of the webinar. Before we end, if you would like to explore road mapping further with the IFM, please get in touch with Rob Driver. The details are just shown on the slides. We'll be sending out the link to this webinar in a couple of days, together with the slides that we just presented. Feel free to review or distribute internally with colleagues. And we hope you really enjoyed this webinar and you found it useful and interesting. Many thanks for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day.